You know, a science fiction story that was written many years ago tells an intriguing story about an inventor who employed Einstein's theories of time and space and invented a printing press that actually printed tomorrow's news today. Now, all newspapers report on yesterday's news today, but this newspaper actually reported on tomorrow's news today. Now, the frantic editor went around and tried to warn people who were involved in accidents and tragedies and all sorts of things. He tried to tell them before it happened, but they thought he was a lunatic. And finally, in desperation, he destroyed the printing press. Now, let me assure you, no such printing press has ever been invented or ever will be invented, because there's one thing human beings can't do, and that is read the future. If we could read the future, you could be a very rich person the middle of next week. Is that right? Because all you need to do is choose, what is it, 6 or 7 numbers in lotto? Well, if someone can read the future, that ought to be very easy for them to do. Just pick the numbers in lotto. Or, if you want to be less complicated, pick the horse that's going to win in the next race and back it with big odds, and you're a rich person. But nobody can do it. Now, it is true that people win lotto. That is true. But they did it because they guessed the numbers and just happened to be lucky with that. Get them to do it next week and see how they get along. It's impossible. Because there's no human being in this earth that's ever lived who can actually read the future. But there is somebody in the universe who can. And he has written it in a little book. And that book is available to us, and I want to share with you some of the great truths of that book in this series. If you will allow me, by attending the programs, I believe that I will present evidence that will convince the most sceptical, if you'll give me an opportunity. I can't do it if you don't give me an opportunity, but if you be fair and give me an opportunity, I believe that I can present, not because I'm smart, that's not what I'm saying, but I would like to present you the evidence that is presented in the book. Is that fair enough? Okay, so we're going to have a look at Matthew 16, right down the bottom of the inside column. It says, "Then the Pharisees and Sadducees," by the way, they were two groups of Jews. They were actually the liberals and the conservatives. The liberals were the Sadducees and the conservatives were the Pharisees. They were just two groups of the Jews. Get the idea? So they're not some folk from space. Then the Pharisees and the Sadducees came and, testing him, asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said to them, "When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and in the morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times." Now, Jesus was toying with these men, these religious leaders, and he was saying to them, look, at night you can go out and you see a red sky, and what does a red sky at night usually suggest? Yeah, it's going to be a good day tomorrow. On the other hand, you get up in the morning and it's a red sky in the east. What's that usually suggest? Yeah, shepherd's warning. We have a saying. That's correct. Now, that saying that we have in our English language comes all the way back from Bible times. They all also understood all about that. And Jesus was saying to them, look, you religious leaders, you understand the signs in the sky. You can tell the type of weather that's coming, but you have no idea about the signs of the times. And he condemned them because they should have known the signs of the times, but they had no idea about it. And the disciples were mystified by this because they didn't know much about the signs of the times either. And one day, when Jesus was on his own on the Mount of Olives, they came to him and they said, "We want you to tell us about these signs of the times." Just come over to Matthew chapter 24 and verse 3, page 960. So it's only just a few pages further on. 960. By the way, when you're turning it up, you'll notice on this page there's a lot of red ink. Is that because the printer ran out of black ink? No, it's not. What's the reason? Yes, in this Bible, all the words that Jesus spoke are in red. Get the idea? Just interesting. So we're going to read now passages that has a lot of red ink on it because they're the words of Jesus. Have a look at verse chapter 24 and verse 3. It says, right down the bottom left-hand corner, "Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age,' or the end of the world? How do we know when your coming is going to be near?" Now, the rest of this chapter, chapter 24 of Matthew, deals with the signs that are going to take place on the earth just before Jesus returns. So that'll be interesting for us to read. So let's have a look. And I'm going to show you this afternoon signs, 5 lots of signs. First of all, signs in the religious world that tell that Christ's coming is soon. Then we're going to have a look at signs in the natural world, the physical world around us. Then we'll see signs in the economic world. We will see signs in the political world. And finally, signs in the social world, all telling us that Jesus is coming soon. And I'm going to read it to you from the Bible. You'll see it with your own 2 eyes. 5 lots of signs. That's what I promised to share with you. Now, the first sign is signs in the religious world. Have a look at verse 4. Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you." Now, instead of saying, well, the first sign is this, Jesus doesn't say that. He says, look out. There's going to be an awful lot of deception before I come back in the religious world. Not everybody is telling the truth. And so he gives a warning. Look out, be careful, don't be deceived. All right, let's read on. "For many will come in my name saying, 'I am the Christ.'" When it says the many, what percentage of the population is the many? Is that the majority or the minority? That's the majority. The majority, Jesus said, are wrong. Therefore, if we're going to base our opinions on what others say, you can almost guarantee that they'll be wrong, because Jesus said they are wrong. That's why it's very important that you don't take notice of what I say or anyone else. Only what Jesus said. That's why we've gone to the trouble of giving you all a Bible. Because I want you to go out every session saying, I can see that's what God says, not what I'm saying, or someone else says, or some church says, because none of that is important. The only thing that's important is what God says. And that's why I want you to read it with your own 2 eyes and not just listen to what I'm saying, but carefully read it and see it for yourself. Because then you can make an informed decision as to whether it's right or whether it's wrong. You're intelligent, you can work it out. But you can't do that if you don't know what is right and what is wrong. And I just want to give you the opportunity of seeing it. All right. "Many will say to me in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many." That's the vast majority. They're deceived. Jesus said that. And when you think about the religious world today and what people say about religion and what they don't say, unfortunately, they're pretty well all wrong. So that's the first red flag that ought to go up in your mind. Be very sceptical about what people tell you, even what churches tell you. Because the only thing that matters is what God says. If it's in the Bible, it's fine. If it's not, don't believe it. All right? After talking about signs in the religious world and warning us about these things, he then goes on to talk about signs in the political world. And if we have a look now at Matthew 24, verse 6 and 7. And you will hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that you are not troubled, for these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. Now, do you think that wars are a sign of Christ coming in themselves and of themselves? No. Why? Why would you say no? And you're correct in saying no. Why aren't wars in themselves a sign of Christ's return? Yeah, there's been plenty of wars down to, we've got two human beings together and you'll have a war. Isn't that right? Yes.
Many other things, earthquakes.
Yeah, well, we're coming to that. But let's just deal with wars at the moment. Wars in themselves are not a sign of Christ's return, but we're going to notice what is a sign of Christ's return is the fact that the intensity of those wars is going to increase as we get closer to the coming of Jesus. Let me illustrate. The First World War, there were 7 times more people killed, historians tell us, this is not what I'm saying, this is what historians tell us, 7 times more people died in the First World War than all the wars of human history put together, up until the First World War. And for those of you who are animal lovers, you will be distressed to know that 8 million horses died in the First World War. Because, of course, the First World War was fought on horseback. But Jesus said these things are really but the beginning, they're not the end. And since the First World War, we've had many other wars, isn't that right? And we still have them in the world today. In fact, Cambridge University, Professor C.M.E. Dodd made this statement a few years ago. He said, there never has been a weapon made that hasn't been used. With nuclear warfare, we can make a bonfire of our world. We could destroy all life. Well, that doesn't take any intelligence to believe that, because we all know that. That's the trouble. We're fearful when we hear about Iran and we hear about North Korea. That's why there's such a push to make sure that North Korea is disarmed, and they want to make sure that Iran is not armed, because these rogue nations, you've got no control over them. And nuclear war. In fact, let me read you something over here in the book of Luke. I'll give you the page. Luke chapter 21, it's page 1019, 1019 at the back of the Bible, 1019. And it sounds like you're getting the idea of turning up the pages pretty well. 1019. And you'll be at Luke, the 21st chapter, and we're going to read verse 25, which is toward the bottom of the inside column, toward the bottom. See that? Luke chapter 21 and verse 25 says this: there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. Now, once again, you'll notice this is in red. This is Luke's rendition of the same sermon from Matthew 24. It's exactly the same sermon, only Luke adds 1 or 2 things that Matthew doesn't. That's why we've gone over to Luke. Because you see, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are really the stories of Jesus' life on this earth. And obviously when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, you will find similar stories in those same apostles. And here we find that Luke now is giving his understanding, his remembrance of Jesus' sermon on the Mount of Olives, and he remembers something that Matthew didn't include. And notice what he says, verse 25, it says, "On the earth distress of nations with perplexity," will be an indication just before Jesus returns. What does it mean, distress of nations with perplexity? What does the word perplexed mean? If you are perplexed, what does that mean? All of these answers are correct. That's what it means. It means you've just got no idea how to handle the situation. You're absolutely perplexed. The Bible says the nations are going to be distressed, perplexed, because they don't know how to solve the world's problems. Then it goes on to say in the next verse, verse 26, "Men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken." In other words, fear is going to grip the hearts of our leaders in the world because they don't know how to solve the world's problems. And today I'm not asking you to have faith in any of this. All I'm just reminding you of what you're hearing every day in the news. Distress of nations with perplexity, men's hearts failing them from fear in thinking about what's going to happen to the earth. And the more you study and read about what's going on in the world today, the more fearful you will get. For example, when the Soviet Union was broken up, many years ago now, because they were strapped for cash, they sold off many of their nuclear armaments. That's why Iran has got it. That's why North Korea. And who else we don't know. Who else may be working on some of these things underground, we don't know. But you can understand how that when rogue people get hold of things like nuclear weapons, the fear that that would bring, because if a nuclear weapon goes off, believe me, there's not going to be too much left. And Jesus is talking about this. In fact, people say to me, well, does the Bible talk about nuclear warfare? Just come over to Revelation chapter 11 and verse 18, and let me read you something here. I'll just give you the page. There it is, 1182, right at the back. The book of Revelation is a book that we will be looking at very closely in some of the meetings. And I don't know of any book that's more fascinating than Revelation is. This is Revelation 11 and verse 18. It says this: "The nations were angry, and your wrath has come." Sounds a bit like today, doesn't it? "And the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that you should reward your servants, the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, small and great." Now, notice the last line. "And should destroy those who" what? Destroy the earth. Now, I want you just to think about that for a moment and see if you agree with my next statement. Ours is the only generation that's lived on the earth that can actually destroy the earth. Prior to the Second World War, was it possible to destroy the earth? Prior to the Second World War, was it? No. But since the Second World War, we have the bomb. And we also are destroying it in what other way? With pollution, environmentally. Yes. And that's only happened pretty well in the lifetime of many of us here. So you see, the book of Revelation, when it talks about destroying those who destroy the earth, that wasn't possible in John's day. It's only possible in our day. in the very time in which we live. And you haven't got to have faith to believe that. You can just read it with your own two eyes. And the more you understand about what's going on, as I said, the more frightening the world is. But I can assure you today that thank God that the world is not going to be destroyed, because this world costs God too much. But He's giving us these signs so that as we see things happening along the way, it encourages our faith. You know what it's like when you're driving your car and you're going to some new place that you're not quite sure where it is, and it's dark, maybe it's wet, and you can't find, and you get frustrated, and suddenly you see something that you were told, look out for such and such, and you see it, and immediately your heart jumps and say, oh, I'm on the right track. Well, that's why God has given us these signs, so that we can be encouraged along the way. Get the idea? As we see these signs fulfilling, it gives us encouragement that our faith is well founded. We're not just believing some fairy tale, some made up story. Well, I want to talk about now signs in the natural world. In the natural world. Come over to Matthew chapter 24. We'll go back to Matthew now, where we started. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 7, page 960. 960, Matthew 24 and verse 7. Goes on to say here, for nation will rise against nation. It's in the second paragraph on the inside column. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be what? Famines. You know, you would think with all the amazing discoveries that we have made today in the area of science, in agriculture and so forth, that we would be able to provide enough food to feed everybody. And while it's probably true we can, the facts are that 2/3 of children go to bed starving every night. 2/3 of the world's population of children go to bed starving every night. Unfortunately, it's very difficult for us to believe that, because we live in such a wonderful land. A land of abundance. And I often thank the Lord in my own way, to thank the Lord for the fact that I have the privilege of living in this country. It is the most wonderful country in the whole world, bar none. No one can hold a candle to this country. That doesn't say we're perfect, and it doesn't say that we've accomplished everything, but I tell you, every other country's got a lot worse problems than we've got. And so I'm grateful for that, and I'm sure you are too, that our path. But we must never ever forget that while we are living in a land of luxury and plenty, that is not the way the vast majority of people live. And we ought to be very mindful of that. And Jesus talked about famines. Listen to what the president of the World Bank said recently. Listen to this. Short of nuclear war itself, population growth is the gravest issue the world faces during the next decade. The threat of unmanageable population pressures can and will have catastrophic consequences if we do not act. The problem will be solved by famine, riot, insurrection and war. Let me illustrate. And I'm not suggesting this is going to happen, but I'm just giving you a scenario. Let's say that people in Indonesia decided that they didn't have very much in Indonesia, which they don't have in Java, in which the population is about at least 120 million the last time I checked, on a little island that's not very big, 120 million. If they all decided to get on a boat and sail down to Australia, which is not that far away, do you think that our border protection and everything else would be able to protect us? Of course they couldn't. Wouldn't have a hope. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's what's going to happen. Not at all. I'm just giving you a scenario that when you live and you're hardly getting enough to eat and you're living in overcrowded situations and the pressures of life are so great on you and you see over the fence people living in luxury and so forth, what do you think is going to happen? Something's going to give. And that's why the president of the World Bank here says that the problem will be solved by famine, riot, insurrection and war. And that's exactly what Jesus said will happen. But he then went on to say, if you have a look back on the text in verse 7 again, if you chapter 24 verse 7, in that first paragraph, for nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, there will be famines. What's the next word there? Pestilences. What's a pestilence? Disease, yes. We often refer to things as pests. Well, that's what the word is, really pestilence. And if you are a bit of a gardener, and I'm sure many of you are, we are spraying for things today that we never had to spray for a few years ago. Pestilences. And I picked up a very interesting book that I'll tell you about in just a moment. You know, you would think with all this smarter doctors and being able to understand medicine like we do today, and we live in a marvellous world because of that. I mean, I've often thought about my grandparents and great-grandparents. If they'd been alive today, they wouldn't have died in the 70s. Because now we've got pills that you can clear your veins and open them up a bit, and if you've got high blood pressure you can lower it and so forth. We live in a marvellous age for that. With all the smarter doctors that we have, you would think that we'd be able to keep up with all these diseases. But it seems to me that while the doctors have been going to college, the pests are going to university. Because they just seem to be just one step ahead all the time of medical science. And Jesus indicated that pestilences will be a major problem. As I said, I came across this book by Laurie Garrett. That's a lady, by the way, called The Coming Plague. And this is what she said. She talked about the new killer diseases of HIV and Ebola and Marburg. And by the way, the virus that killed a fellow by the name of Vic Rail here in Brisbane many, many years ago now, and his horses, you may remember that. Was it? Yes. Well, they still don't know what killed them, those horses. It's a mystery virus. Mystery. They have no idea. And she cites this in her book. And she mentions these are just the first signs of terrifying worldwide resurgence of infectious diseases. And we will all remember, those of us who here will remember penicillin and how the marvellous discovery of penicillin, which has saved so many people's lives. But the trouble is today that the human body is building up an immunity against the very things that have saved us for years. And there are many doctors, unfortunately, who overprescribe antibiotics. And you'll read about it. You Google this and see how serious this is. Because what that's doing is that it's building up in the human body a resistance against the very things that are there to help to save us. Get the idea? Because the expectation, when you go to the doctor and you've got something wrong, what's the expectation? What do most human beings want the doctor to do? Yeah, give you a few pills to solve the problem, isn't that right? So if the doctor doesn't give you something, you say, oh, I'm going to go and see another doctor. Because that's the mentality that we all have now. A pill will fix it. And so the doctors know that, so they give out these pills. But they're actually hurting us. And that's what Laurie Garrett is pointing out in this book. Let me read you something else, because we can't dwell on any one of these things too long. The next thing in verse 7 is what? Earthquakes. Jesus mentioned earthquakes. And once again, I don't have to prove any of this to you. All I need to do is to remind you, have a look at Google. If you don't think that earthquakes are increasing, then you Google earthquakes when you go home, and you will be greatly surprised at the intensity of all of these signs. In other words, we're not saying any one of these signs on their own is enough. What we're saying is that there's an intensity of these signs the closer we're getting to the coming of Jesus. And earthquakes certainly establish that. And if, as I said, if you doubt me, just you do your own research tonight when you go home. Have a look at chapter 24 and verse 15 of Matthew again, where Jesus mentions a certain prophet by the name of Daniel. Have a look at verse 15. He says, therefore, this is in the middle of the page, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Now, it's interesting, in connection with his second coming, Jesus said, study, understand Daniel. Now, that's interesting because I find most, even people who read their Bible a bit, and that's not a lot of people these days, unfortunately, but even people who read the Bible have hardly ever read Daniel, hardly know anything about it. And yet Jesus said, study the book of Daniel. Well, we're going to do that in the meetings, not so much tonight, although I want to go back to the book of Daniel now, just to read you something that's very interesting. So, would you come back to the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 12, page 871. 871, Daniel chapter 12. Daniel lived about 600 years before Christ. So it's a long time ago. And he says in verse 4, but you, Daniel, shut up the words, seal the book until the time of the end. Let me illustrate here on the screen what the time of the end is. Now, the time of the end is not the end of time. The end of time is when Jesus comes back. The time of the end is a little period here called the time of the end, just before the end of time. Does that make sense? So the book of Daniel was going to be sealed up until the time of the end. In other words, until this period here, just before the end of time. Does that make sense? Seal it up until the time of the end. Now, how will we know when the time of the end begins? Well, just read on a little more. It says, verse 4, many shall run to and fro, and what's going to increase? Knowledge is going to increase. In other words, the sign of the time of the end will be an explosion in knowledge. Is that true today? It's just absolutely bewildering. I mean, there's tremendous advantages with it. Instead of having to go down to the library now, you can just Google anything. And that's a wonderful thing in many ways. But the explosion or the availability of knowledge today is so great that no one on this earth can even keep up in one area of knowledge, let alone to be conversant on many things of knowledge. That's impossible because we know so much. I heard about a fellow recently who was awarded a PhD, and his study was not flies. He did it on a fly, but it wasn't just a fly. It was, he was dealing with one of the hairs on the back leg of the fly. Because a fly is too big. You can't study a PhD on the subject of a fly. That's far too big. It's got to be narrowed down. Anyone who's done any higher study knows what I'm talking about. You've got to narrow down your field until you are quite unique in what you're studying. Because we know so much about so many things. And Jesus said that the time of the end will be illustrated by an increase, an explosion in knowledge. Now, I don't have to prove that to anyone. You know that as well as I do. And Jesus indicated, study the book of Daniel, because Daniel is dealing with this period called the time of the end. That's why we are going to study the book of Daniel carefully. And then he goes on to talk about the next sign, and I'd like you to have a look at the book of James. Just come over to, we could talk about airspace and space travel, all the rest as indicators of the time. Daniel 12 and verse 6. Well, we'll pass that by too, I think, because of time. Let's deal with signs now in the economic world. And we'll go over to the book of James at the back of the Bible. Right down the back, it is page 1161. 1161 at the back. 1161. This is the book of James. Not a book that many people read often, but it's a wonderful little book. Only got 5 chapters, as you'll see. James chapter 5, verse 1. Page 1161. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Now this is addressing the rich. Now often we don't associate the rich with crying out. It says, your riches are corrupted and your garments are moth-eaten. Now you understand the illustration here. You might have a beautiful dress, ladies, or a suit. Men, that's you're hanging in the wardrobe, and if the silverfish get in and they take a little nip out of something, the whole garment's gone, isn't that right? And that is what James here is talking about. Your garments are moth-eaten, in other words, worthless, and your riches are corrupted. In other words, they've come to naught, which would suggest that money is going to lose its value. Verse 3, your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. Is that true, by the way? People have heaped up treasure today? If you own a house here in Brisbane, then you are a fairly well-off person. If you own one in Sydney, you're even better off. Because, as we all know, real estate has taken a dive up. And there have been just millions of millionaires created, not because of people have been able to work hard, but simply because real estate. And it wouldn't surprise me, and I'm not going to ask, but it wouldn't surprise me that there are some folk here who are millionaires through real estate. And Jesus here, through James, is saying that in the last days, wealth is going to be heaped up, but it's going to lose its value. Verse 4, indeed, the wages of the labourers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the reaper have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You know, when I read that, I just think of what's been going on in the banks and so forth. Because these big multinational organisations and banks and so forth, as we have heard, it's all nothing to do with helping their customers. It's all grabbing wealth for themselves. And it's all come to light. It's come out in the open. If we said that before, you would have said, oh, you're being a bit hard. No, now we're all seeing it. And this is what James is talking about here, that they have exploited the workers. And finally, James says in verse 7, therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and the latter rain. In other words, be patient, God is telling us, because things are bad, but Jesus is still coming, and he's coming soon. And these things, again, have been given to us to encourage us along the way, so that as we see them being fulfilled, it gives us courage. Now, I want to deal with one last sign before we go, and that's signs in the social world. Come over to Matthew chapter 24, where we started, back to Matthew the 24th chapter. It is page 961, 961. Matthew chapter 24. And we'll pick up here verse 37. Well, maybe we'll read verse 36 just to get the context, I think. Verse 36 at the beginning of the paragraph there. But of that day and hour knows no one, not even the angels of heaven. So how many people know the exact time of Christ's return? No one. And if someone tells you that Christ is coming back on such and such a date, you know they're wrong, because no one knows that. Then he says in verse 37, but as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. In other words, Jesus is saying, if you want to have a look at the parallel of the world today, go back to the days of Noah and you will see exactly a mirror image of the conditions that will be in the world just before Jesus returns. Let's just go back to the days before the flood. Come back to Genesis chapter 6 at the beginning of the Bible, right at the very beginning, page 5. You can't get much earlier than that, page 5. And it's Genesis chapter 6 and verse 11. Well, if you read from verse 1 actually, you will see there it talks about, now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth. There was a population explosion just before the flood. And remember, Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, and you and I are witnessing a population growth today, which is incredible. Come down to verse 11. I haven't got time to read all. You might like to read that when you get home or some other time. Verse 11, the earth also was corrupt before God. Remember, this is talking about the world just before the flood, what we call the antediluvian world. And the first characteristic of that world was it was corrupt. And Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, so it's also going to be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. Tell me, would you think that I was exaggerating if I said that our world today, society in Australia, is corrupt? Would that be all right? Absolutely. And we see it in every area of life. Corruption. And then it goes on to say, and the earth was filled with violence. Is that a parallel today? Yes. Violence. And I would predict that when you pick up the newspaper tomorrow morning, you will find that there's been more murders and so forth over tonight and today. Just in this area, you know, in Brisbane, let alone Sydney and Melbourne and all the rest. Corrupt and violent. And I would like to suggest for your contemplation that one of the major causes of that corruption and the violence is because of Hollywood. What people are viewing on the theatre and on television. Let me prove to you what I've just said, because I want to establish it. Back in 1981, two researchers by the name of Joyce Frafkin and Teresa Silverman monitored 58 programs on primetime television. When we talk about primetime television, what time are we talking about? Prime time. What time's that? Yeah, about 6 o'clock till about 10 o'clock. Reason it's called prime time is because that's when most people are watching television, right? In that period. So we're talking about prime time television, and they monitored how many? 58 programs. In the programs they found 41 instances of sex outside marriage and only 6 between married people. 41 outside marriage, 6 inside marriage. 10 years later, extramarital sex had dramatically increased. From April 28 to May 25, they logged 615 instances of sexual activity depicted or discussed on primetime television. A ratio of 13 to 1, 571 favouring sex outside marriage to 44 inside marriage. So what is the message that's coming across to all viewers, particularly young viewers?
It's okay. Anything goes.
Yeah. It's normal. That's normal. And so...
Social engineering.
Yes, it's because it's brainwashing our minds into thinking that that is okay. And you'll know, as well as I do, that most teenagers today don't get married first, they live together first, and then maybe after child 1 or 2 comes along, they decide, well, perhaps we better get married. Isn't that true? Yes, of course it is. Hollywood is telling us that there is no fun without sin and no kiss except a stolen one. That's where you have fun. No doubt you remember, it's a while ago now, so some of you may not remember. Do you remember hearing about the film called Silence of the Lambs? The reason I'm still talking about it is because it is only the 3rd film in history to win all the major awards. There's only ever been 3, to my knowledge to this day, that have ever won all the major awards. What we mean by that is Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Director, Best Screenplay, Best this, Best that, Best everything. There's only been 3 films that have ever done it. And Silence of the Lambs is the latest one, or the last one, a few years ago now. Now, because most of you, including myself, have not seen it, nor do I want to see it, I want to read you what Silence of the Lambs is about. This is from a film critic. He was reviewing the film. So I wrote it down. This is what he said. The plot of Silence of the Lambs centres on a transvestite serial killer who stuffs the larvae of a rare moth down the throats of his victims after he has skinned them. He selects overweight women as the targets of his wrath, holding them prisoner and starving them for a time before slaughtering them, so that their skin will hang loose on their frames. The criminals are so bizarre and extreme in their sadistic pleasures that they are more ridiculous than frightening. Now that's the film that won all the awards. That's what it's about. Now you imagine the sick mind to devise such a screenplay about that. What on all the earth is life coming to? If a person wants to live a transvestite life, that's business for them, that's fine. But why should that be pushed upon the vast majority of us who are not transvestites? And I've been in the media for many years. I know how it ticks. And I have gone along to some of these directors and I have said to them, look, why are you trying to change people's values? Oh no, they said, we're not trying to do that at all. We're in the entertaining business. We are not trying to change people's ideas. Well, then I change my hat this day and I go to see them because I want to do some advertising on their television station. So I go along to the directors and I say, look, I want to sell this product. Do you think that you can help by changing people's attitudes and for them to like my product rather than the opposition's? Yes, I said, that's the business we're in. Can you see the 2 sides of the mouth that they're talking from? Yes. And unfortunately, our young people are listening to this type of stuff. And because of their lack of experience of life, they cannot always distinguish between that which is right and that which is really wrong. And it colours their mind. I had a lady, I read about a lady who wrote to Channel 9 in Sydney recently, and this is what she said. I'm sick to death of the crude and vulgar language. How much more explicit can it get? Why must decent people be embarrassed in front of their children by obscene words? Now, I'll tell you what some of these obscene words are. I am staggered by the number of girls, teenage girls, that I hear use the F word. Now, I sometimes think to myself, girl, do you really understand what you're talking about? Because you're the victim of that type of activity. Not the guys, you will be. And if you listen to the teenagers talk, you will hear the F word used over and over and over and over again. Now, is it because that's the lifestyle they're living? No, I don't think necessarily. I just think that that's what the word they're hearing all the time. And so they think it's part of normal talk. Because if you tune into television after about 10 o'clock at night, you'll even hear it on our television. Let alone in the films, where it's just plastered everywhere. And so you're bringing up your kids and they're being exposed to this type of language all the time. And Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, so it's also going to be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. I want to read you one last verse because I don't want you to go home feeling down and negative about this, because I've had to deal with a lot of negative things, but I want to end on a very high note of optimism. Come over to the book of Luke, and Luke chapter 21, page 1019, our last verse, and then we'll let you go home. 1019, and it's Luke chapter 21, verse 25, where we were reading before. But I want to read the next verse that we didn't read before. Luke 21, verse 25. You know, there will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on the earth the stress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear, and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven will be shaken. Now, verse 27. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, when these things begin to happen, that is, all the things that we've been reading about today, when we see them happening, what does Jesus say we're to do? Be frightened? No, don't be frightened. Look up. Lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. In other words, Jesus is about to return. See, let's say that I know that your house is going to burn down in the next 6 months. I know it. For sure. Your house is going to burn down. All right? Would you want me to tell you that, or would you prefer me not to tell you, to be silent and then let it take place? What would you prefer me to do? Now, tell you? But that's terrible bad news. Why do you want me to tell you bad news? We have a good answer down the front. I'm sure others said it too. Why is it important to know? It gives you time to prepare, isn't that right? Yes. What are some of the things that you might prepare to do if you knew your house was going to burn down in 6 months? What would you do?
Well, you just said that it was guaranteed to happen, so even if I knew, it wouldn't make a difference. It's guaranteed. Yes, it's going to happen. Your house is going to burn down. You would just move all your stuff out.
All right, so you would, in preparation, you would move all your stuff out. That's a good answer?
Insure it.
You'd insure it? Someone would sell it? Okay, yes. The poor person that comes in next, never mind, yes, sell it. You'd bump up your insurance probably and double your insurance. Yes, I know you. Yeah, we would do, all of us would do those things if we really knew that it was going to happen, right? And I'm with you, I would want to know, if you knew my house was going to burn down, I'd want you to tell me, so I've got time to prepare. Now that's the reason why Jesus has told us these things, not to frighten us, but to give us time to prepare. Get the idea? So that we are not taken unawares when these things happen. And I trust today that God will help us as we begin to study the Bible. We will see the good news of why God has told us these things. He doesn't want any of us to be lost. He wants us to enjoy the rest of life. And so I trust that God will help us. Now, as I said, tomorrow afternoon I'm going to talk to you about the subject of how we can be right with God. Because if Jesus is coming soon, the important thing is, how can then I be ready for him? Because I'm not too ready at the moment. How could I be ready? Well, that's what I want to deal with tomorrow afternoon. Get the idea? So that we can then be ready for when he does come back. I think it'd be nice if we just bowed our heads in prayer. All right? Dear Lord, I just want to thank you again this afternoon in the quietness of this hour for your love. I thank you that you have told us these things, not to frighten us, but because you love us, because you don't want any of us to be lost. You want to give us time to prepare, to get things, our life in order, in preparation for that day. And so I pray that you will help us, that you will bless us, and above all things, that we might be ready when you come very soon, I pray for Christ's sake. Amen.